I think following very intelligence-heavy presentations, which are fascinating, I'm going to present it from a slightly different perspective, thinking about how we look at other issues in the region, and specifically what's happening post-October 7th and how it exposed a lot of long-simmering vulnerabilities in our ability to counter terrorism in the Middle East, and also changing regional priorities and interests. We've seen the conflict in Gaza, the increased attacks by Iranian-backed militias, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the Iran-Israel war, and a reorganization of both state and non-state priorities. And we've seen basically an increased security environment. And despite all of that, the threat posed by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq remains. The group is striving to take advantage of the October 7th turmoil to rebuild their ranks and recruit. And while there's plenty to keep intelligence officers and policymakers busy in the Middle East, historical lessons show that just because we don't think an issue is the most pressing at the time does not mean it won't resurge. For instance, for example, Hamas before the devastating attacks of October 7th had researchers and policymakers discounting the group, arguing the governance had moderated Hamas and it was no longer a threat and more pragmatic. And as Mark mentioned, we saw that in the US intelligence community and policy community, the expertise on Hamas disappeared. And for the Islamic State, I think there are very few who would argue that it has moderated, but many point to other pressing issues in the region, or in fact, the effective counterterrorism campaign against the group to contend it is no longer the threat it once was. And while this may in part be true, I don't think it offers a full picture of the Islamic State, its goals, and how it really strives to use instability and sectarian issues to regroup and recruit. And I think looking at the Islamic State's history is extremely important for understanding this. It shows adaptability from its origins in the 1990s in Afghanistan and then Iraq, where it waged sectarian violence, to the 2006-2010 period, where it sought to rebuild its organization, to the 2011-2016 period, where it carried out transnational expansion, and even in its state of decline, where it lost the final territory in 2019. Throughout all of this, and even today, the Islamic State has sought to take advantage of under-governed spaces, sectarian issues, and terse regional dynamics. And the fall of the group's so-called caliphate created actually one of the greatest counterterrorism problems that we have today, and really complicated our fight against the group. And that's the indefinite detention of thousands of Syrians, Iraqis, and third country nationals, a problem that is not easily solved by traditional counterterrorism methods. And since that fall of that caliphate, we've redefined the threat posed by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. CENTCOM in 2022 redefined it into a tripartite threat. First is the Islamic State at large, the insurgency in Syria and Iraq that is still fighting today, its leaders and its operatives. The second is the Islamic State in detention. That's the thousands of men and some teenage boys, as well as some women and girls who are held in detention facilities in both Iraq and Syria. And the third is what we call the next generation of the Islamic State. That is tens of thousands of primarily women and children held in indefinite detention in camps like Al Hol and Roj. And this policy led to a bifurcation of US funding on counterterrorism as well. We have hard counterterrorism funds, which come from the Department of Defense's Counter-Islamic State Train and Equip Fund, which goes to counter the insurgency, the IS detention facilities holding primarily adult men, and guarding the outside of detention camps holding women and children. And we have soft counterterrorism funds, primarily from US Aid and State Department. And this ran the operations of the detention camps, but it also focused on repatriation, reintegration, and stabilization efforts. Historically, unfortunately, soft counterterrorism funds are often the first to go. They are harder to justify. They are long-term results rather than immediate answers. And so it's a change we are currently seeing in US policy. The Trump administration has cut much of US aid and State Department funding for Syria and Iraq, presenting both short and long-term humanitarian and security challenges for countering the Islamic State. But hard counterterrorism alone cannot counter the Islamic State. And that's a difficult lesson we saw the US learn in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And we are seeing Israel learn today with 2 years of war with Hamas. Once again, the group remains and it's seeking to resurge and fill the gap of the undergoverned spaces. And in Syria, and to a lesser extent Iraq, there are a lot of undergoverned spaces. Syria's civil war led it to be divided into many spheres of influence and control. In addition to the Assad control areas, which you can see over here, we have many other actors jostling for power. We see Russia and Iran, Turkey and its sponsored militias, HTS, the US-led coalition and the Syrian Democratic Forces, and, importantly, the Islamic State itself, which used the deconflict lines between all of these actors to remain and maintain safe havens. And the fall of Assad created power vacuums in Syria. And as Syria seeks to rebuild and open to the international community, it faces many challenges. Primarily, it is not yet stable, nor is it united, with sectarian issues arising in the southwest between the Druze and Damascus, which is Sunni-led, and Kurds in the northeast. And all of this comes as Trump is hinting at wanting to decrease the US presence. In military terms, the counter-Islamic State campaign has been quantitatively successful. According to the UN, in 2019, we had 18,000 fighters across Syria and Iraq. Today, that number is around 3,000. Counterterrorism operations have eliminated 4 leaders, many operatives, and even the group's claimed attacks are down. But that might not tell the whole picture. For example, if we look at just sleeper cell attacks, these are from the SDF's reported attacks claimed in just the northeast of the country, they actually are quantitatively higher than the whole country. And so it's showing that the Islamic State is likely underreporting. And we can see this again, because despite its losses and its decrease in attacks down to 2023, we saw a resurgence in 2024 as part of its Gaza revenge campaign. Again, another indicator that the group is seemingly intact and that it is underreporting its strength. And so many researchers argue that the Islamic State is just waiting out its strongest enemy, the United States, to lose interest. And again, similarities can be drawn to Hamas's actions in Gaza, where in the years leading up to October 7th, Hamas sought to hide its true capacity from Israel and the international community. The indefinite detention of thousands of Islamic State affiliates continues to exacerbate the already precarious situation. And importantly is to understand how the Islamic State thinks about this issue. They have not lost sight of this population in order to help it resurge. Thinking back to its past Breaking the Walls campaign in 2012 and 2013, where it sought to break out hundreds of fighters from prisons in Iraq. And today this population is divided into roughly 2 categories, as I mentioned, about previously 10,000, now down to only 9,000 men and teenage boys who are held in detention facilities, and once peaking at 70,000 and now down to 30,000, primarily women and children held across Al-Hol and Roj camps. Both these populations are held without trial by the Syrian Democratic Forces, whose non-state status has really complicated both the humanitarian and security situation, which has only worsened since the fall of Assad as the SDF has turned its attention both towards Damascus and Turkey, and as US funding has been cut. These detention camps and facilities highlight some of the reasons that countering the Islamic State today is harder than ever. They not only hinge on a positive SDF-Damascus relationship with meddling external actors like the United States and Turkey, but they also count on international actors repatriating and reintegrating their citizens at a time where the usefulness of soft counterterrorism is being questioned. I think there's also other indicators when it comes to the Islamic State that we need to look at to understand its strength that is very important for intelligence services and policymakers. And that is within a few short months of its territorial collapse in early 2019. By June, they'd already shown abilities to do a form of shadow governance and had not given up their ambition for governance. And that includes collecting taxes, moral policing, administrative documents, and retaking territory briefly. So when security forces leave at night, they would take over certain towns and villages at night. And what they have done is they've continued to project power and instill fear in populations. And what it's doing is it's creating a mechanism so should it ever retake territory, it can resurge quite quickly. But more immediately, it's helping its fundraising efforts and allowing it to carry out its terrorism and insurgency campaigns. And again, something we've seen throughout the Gaza war, as Hamas stole aid and used the black market to finance self, and as we've now seen Israel withdraw, re-exert its control quickly and instill fear in local populations. Which brings me to Iraq. Though the Islamic State is no longer an existential threat to Iraq the way it once was, Iraq is still extremely reliant on the global coalition, and specifically the US, to carry out mission planning, airstrikes, intelligence operations, and other key tasks. In addition, ongoing disagreements between Baghdad and Kurdistan have left vulnerable and disputed areas in Kirkuk and Dilia, particularly, which are vulnerable to the Islamic State's recruitment, which specifically focuses on governance gaps and sectarian issues. There's also a lot of internal issues. The IDP camps were closed by the Iraqi government, which has left informal settlements where these IDP camps once were, where individuals are living without any government assistance. Again, this creates a point of recruitment for the Islamic State. Added to this, the Iraqi government has repatriated more than 20,000 Islamic State-affiliated women and children and families from Al-Hol camp in Syria and brought them to Al-Amal camp, formerly Jeddah 1, in Iraq. And so what we're seeing is a divided within society and resentment. People associated with the Islamic State are receiving government aid, whereas those who were victims of the group are not. The Gaza war also created a lot of internal tensions with Iranian influence in the country. We started to see a renewed effort of Iranian militias launching attacks from Iraq and pressure on the government to sever ties with the US. And because of this pressure, also with Iraq's wanting to maintain its own desire for autonomy, we saw Baghdad initiate the end of the global coalition's mission in exchange for bilateral relations. While this wasn't surprising given debates in both countries, I think the regime change and the instability in Syria really shocked Iraq, and they began to have a little bit of buyer's remorse. In fact, we saw just in the last 48 hours Iraq asking the coalition to extend its mission. And all of this is happening as the US wants to leave the region and as they are cutting Iraq's funding for repatriation, reintegration, and stabilization efforts. And Iraq is dealing with overcrowded prisons that have held al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates for almost a decade. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in Iraq, but also a lot of threats. The Islamic State is severely weakened, but it seeks to exploit fractures, which we are seeing more and more. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from Iraq, the Islamic State's first resurgence in Iraq, that we need to pay attention to, specifically undergoverned spaces, sectarian issues, and regional tensions that only fuel the group. I will just conclude by saying the fight against the Islamic State isn't over. It may feel unpressing to focus on repatriation, rebuilding, and stabilization efforts, but they are so important to ensuring the Islamic State doesn't resurge. It doesn't take advantage to a threat at hand. Of course, questions remain over in both Syria and Iraq if instability, external actors, meddling, and sectarian issues in undergoverned spaces will create the opportunity for the Islamic State to resurge. But I think it's important to remember the Islamic State has learned its lessons. It has resurged before. It has laid in wait. And so we need to look at its past governance, its foundation that has laid for resurgence, and pay attention to it. And we also need to look at our own past counterterrorism history to learn lessons to stop this from happening. Thank you.